A cluster munition is a form of airdropped or ground-launched explosive weapon that releases or ejects smaller submunitions. Commonly, this is a cluster bomb that ejects explosive bomblets that are designed to kill personnel and destroy vehicles. Other cluster munitions are designed to destroy runways or electric power transmission lines, disperse chemical or biological weapons, or to scatter land mines. Some submunition-based weapons can disperse non-munitions, such as leaflets. Because cluster bombs release many small bomblets over a wide area, they pose risks to civilians both during attacks and afterwards. Unexploded bomblets can kill or maim civilians and slash or unintended targets long after a conflict has ended, and are costly to locate and remove. Cluster munitions are prohibited for those nations that ratify the Convention on Cluster Munitions, adopted in Dublin, Ireland in May 2008. The convention entered into force and became binding international law upon ratifying states on August 1, 2010, 6 months after being ratified by 30 states. As of October 1, 2015, a total of 118 states have joined the convention, as 98 states parties and 20 signatories. Development. The first cluster bomb used operationally was the German SD-2 or Sprengbomb Dickwandig 2 kg, commonly referred to as the butterfly bomb. It was used in World War II to attack both civilian and military targets. The technology was developed independently by the United States, Russia, and Italy. See thermos bomb. The US used the 20 lb M41 fragmentation bomb wired together in clusters of 6 or 25 with highly sensitive or proximity fuses. From the 1970s to the 1990s, cluster bombs became standard airdropped munitions for many nations, in a wide variety of types. They have been produced by 34 countries and used in at least 23. Artillery shells that employ similar principles have existed for decades. They are typically referred to as ICM, improved conventional munitions, shells. The U.S. military slang terms for them are firecracker or popcorn shells, for the many small explosions they cause in the target area. Types. A basic cluster bomb consists of a hollow shell and then 2 to more than 2,000 submunitions or bomblets contained within it. Some types are dispensers that are designed to be retained by the aircraft after releasing their munitions. The submunitions themselves may be fitted with small parachute retarders or streamers to slow their descent, allowing the aircraft to escape the blast area in low-altitude attacks. Modern cluster bombs and submunition dispensers are often multiple-purpose weapons, containing mixtures of anti-armor, anti-personnel, and anti-materiel munitions. The submunitions themselves may also be multi-purpose, such as combining a shaped charge, to attack armor, with a fragmenting case, to attack infantry, material, and light vehicles. Modern multipurpose munitions may also have an incendiary effect. Recently, submunition-based weapons have been designed that deploy smart submunitions, using thermal and visual sensors to locate and attack particular targets, usually armored vehicles. Weapons of this type include the US CBU-97 sensor-fused weapon, first used in combat during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Munitions specifically intended for anti-tank use may be set to self-destruct if they reach the ground without locating a target, theoretically reducing the risk of unintended civilian deaths and injuries. Although smart submunition weapons are many times more expensive than standard cluster bombs, which are cheaper and simpler to manufacture, far fewer smart submunitions are required for defeating dispersed and mobile targets in an area, offsetting this cost. On the basis that they should not cause the indiscriminate area effects or unexploded ordnance risks of cluster munitions, these submunitions are not classified as cluster munitions under the definition of the weapon enshrined in international law by the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Incendiary. Incendiary cluster bombs are intended to start fires, just as conventional incendiary bombs, also called fire bombs. They are specifically designed for this purpose, with submunitions of white phosphorus or napalm, and they often include anti-personnel and anti-tank submunitions to hamper firefighting efforts. When used in cities, they have often been preceded by the use of conventional explosive bombs to break open the roofs and walls of buildings to expose flammable contents to the incendiaries. One of the earliest examples is the so-called Molotov bread basket, first used by the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939–40. This type of munition was extensively used by both sides in the strategic bombings of World War II. Bombs of this type were used to start firestorms or conflagrations in cases such as the bombing of Dresden in World War II and the firebombing of Tokyo. In some modern bombs, submunitions are used to deliver a highly combustible thermobaric aerosol, which is subsequently ignited, resulting in a high-pressure explosion. Anti-personnel. Anti-personnel cluster bombs use explosive fragmentation to kill troops and destroy soft, unarmored, targets. Along with incendiary cluster bombs, these were among the first forms of cluster bombs produced by Germany during World War II. They were famously used during the Blitz with delay and booby trap fusing to hamper firefighting and other damage control efforts in the bombed areas. They were also used with a contact fuse when attacking entrenchments. These weapons were most widely used during the Vietnam War, when many thousands of tons of submunitions were dropped on Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Anti-tank. Most anti-armor munitions contain shaped charge warheads to pierce the armor of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. In some cases, guidance is used to increase the likelihood of successfully hitting a vehicle. Modern guided submunitions, such as those found in the US CBU-97, can use either a shaped charge or an explosively formed penetrator. Unguided shaped charge submunitions are designed to be effective against entrenchments that incorporate overhead cover. To simplify supply and increase battlefield effectiveness by allowing a single type of round to be used against nearly any target, submunitions that incorporate both fragmentation and shaped charge effects are produced. Mine laying. When submunition-based weapons are used to disperse mines, their submunitions do not detonate immediately, but behave like conventional landmines that detonate later. The submunitions usually include a combination of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. Since such mines usually lie on exposed surfaces, the anti-personnel forms, such as the U.S. area denial artillery munition, normally deploy tripwires automatically after landing to make clearing the minefield more difficult. In order to avoid rendering large portions of the battlefield permanently impassable, and to minimize the amount of mine clearing needed after a conflict, scatterable mines used by the United States are designed to self-destruct after a period of time from 4 to 48 hours. The internationally agreed definition of cluster munitions being negotiated in the Oslo process may not include this type of weapon, since landmines are already covered in other specific international instruments. Chemical weapons. During the 1950s and 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union developed cluster weapons designed to deliver chemical weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993 banned their use. 6 nations declared themselves in possession of chemical weapons. The US and Russia are in the process of destroying their stockpiles, although they have received extensions for the full destruction, not having completed the destruction of their chemical weapons stockpiles by 2007, as the treaty had originally intended. Anti-electrical. An anti-electrical weapon, the CBU-94/B, was first used by the US in the Kosovo War in 1999. These consist of a TMD, tactical munitions dispenser, filled with 202 Blue 114/B soft bomb submunitions. Each submunition contains a small explosive charge that disperses 147 reels of fine conductive fiber of either carbon or aluminum-coated glass. Their purpose is to disrupt and damage electric power transmission systems by producing short circuits in high-voltage power lines and electrical substations. On the first attack, these knocked out 70% of the electrical power supply in Serbia. There are reports that it took 500 people 15 hours to get one transformer yard back online after being hit with these weapons. Leaflet dispensing. The LBU-30 is designed for dropping large quantities of propaganda leaflets from aircraft. Enclosing the leaflets within the bomblets ensures that the leaflets will fall on the intended area without being dispersed excessively by the wind. The LBU-30 consists of SUU-30 dispensers that have been adapted to leaflet dispersal. The dispensers are essentially recycled units from old bombs. The LBU-30 was tested at Eglin Air Force Base in 2000, by an F-16 flying at 20,000 feet, 6,100 m. History of use. Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. used cluster bombs in airstrikes against targets in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. According to The Guardian, of the 260 million cluster bomblets that rained down on Laos between 1964 and 1973, particularly on Dien Con province, 80 million failed to explode. The Global Post reports that as of 2009 about 7,000 people have been injured or killed by explosives left from the Vietnam War era in the Vietnamese Quang Tri province alone. Western Sahara War, 1975–1991. During the 16 years-long conflict on the territory of Western Sahara, the Royal Moroccan Army, RMA, dropped cluster bombs. The RMA used both artillery-fired and air-dropped cluster munitions. Blue 63, M42 and Mk118 submunitions were used at multiple locations in Berlalu, Tafarity, Mahathires, Majak, and Aganit. More than 300 cluster strike areas have been recorded in the Minurso Mine Action Coordination Center database. Falklands War. Sea Harriers of the Royal Navy dropped BL-755 cluster bombs on Argentinian positions during the Falklands War of 1982. Nagorno-Karabakh War, 1992–1994, 2016. Hundreds of cluster bombs were used by Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh in 1992–94 in the course of the Nagorno-Karabakh War. As of 2010, 93 square kilometers remain off-limits due to contamination with unexploded cluster ordnance. Halo Trust has made major contributions to the cleanup effort. Halo Trust reported the use of cluster bombs by Azerbaijan during renewed hostilities in April 2016. First Chechen War, 1995. Used by Russia, see also 1995 Shali cluster bomb attack. Croatia, 1995. Used by Republic of Serbian Krajina, see also Zagreb rocket attacks. Yugoslavia, 1999. Used by the US, the UK and Netherlands. About 2,000 cluster bombs containing 380,000 submunitions were dropped on Yugoslavia during the Operation Allied Force, in 1999, of which the Royal Air Force dropped 531 RBL-755 cluster bombs. On May 7, 1999, between the time of 11:30 and 11:40, a NATO attack was carried out with 2 containers of cluster bombs directed at Nye Airport, located at the end of the city. The bombs missed their target and fell near the city center. The bombs were scattered from the 2 containers and were carried by the wind and then fell in 3 locations in the central part of the city. The pathology building next to the medical center of NIS in the south of the city. Next to the building of Baynovina including the main market, bus station next to the Nye Fortress and February 12 Health Center. Parking of Nye Express near River Neva River. Reports claimed that 15 civilians were killed, 8 civilians were seriously injured, 11 civilians had sustained minor injuries, 120 housing units were damaged and 47 were destroyed and that 15 cars were damaged. Overall during the operation, at least 23 Serb civilians were killed by cluster munitions. At least 6 Serbs, including 3 children, were killed by bomblets after the operation ended, and up to 23 square kilometers in 6 areas remain cluster contaminated, according to Serbian government, including on Mt Kobanik near the slopes of the ski resort. The UK contributed £86,000 to the Serbian Mine Action Centre. Second Chechen War. Russia repeatedly fired cluster munitions into Chechnya. Afghanistan, 2001–2002. United States and other NATO countries used large numbers of cluster munitions during the initial stage of the operation. 1,228 cluster bombs containing 248,056 bomblets were used by the coalition. Iraq. Used by the United States and the United Kingdom. 1991. United States, France, and the United Kingdom dropped 61,000 cluster bombs, containing 20 million submunitions, on Iraq, according to the HRW. 2003–2006, United States and allies attacked Iraq with 13,000 cluster munitions, containing 2 million submunitions during Operation Iraqi Freedom, according to the HRW. At multiple times, coalition forces used cluster munitions in residential areas, and the country remains among the most contaminated by this day, bomblets posing a threat to both U.S. military personnel in the area, and local civilians. When these weapons were fired on Baghdad on April 7, 2003, many of the bomblets failed to explode on impact. Afterward, some of them exploded when touched by civilians. USA Today reported that the Pentagon presented a misleading picture during the war of the extent to which cluster weapons were being used and of the civilian casualties they were causing. On April 26, General Richard Myers, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that the U.S. had caused only one civilian casualty. Lebanon, 1978, 1982 and 2006. Extensively used by Israel during the 1978 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the 1982-2000 occupation of Lebanon, and also by Hezbollah in the 2006 Lebanon War. During the Israeli-Lebanese conflict in 1982, Israel used cluster munitions, many of them American-made, on targets in southern Lebanon. Israel also used cluster bombs in the 2006 Lebanon War. Two types of cluster munitions were transferred to Israel from the U.S. The first was the CBU-58, which uses the Blue 63 bomblet. This cluster bomb is no longer in production. The second was the Mk-20 Rockeye, produced by Honeywell Incorporated in Minneapolis. The CBU-58 was used by Israel in Lebanon in both 1978 and 1982. The Israeli defense company Israel Military Industries also manufactures the more up-to-date M85 cluster bomb. Hezbollah fired Chinese-manufactured cluster munitions against Israeli civilian targets, using 122mm rocket launchers during the 2006 war, hitting Kiryat Mozkin, Nahariya, Carmel, Magar, and Safsufa. A total of 113 rockets and 4,407 submunitions were fired into Israel during the war. Israel dropped up to 4 million submunitions on Lebanese soil, 1 million of which remain unexploded duds, according to the United Nations Mine Action Service. Throughout the 34-day conflict, the United States resupplied Israel's arsenal of cluster bombs, which prompted an investigation by the State Department to examine if Israel had violated secret agreements it signed with the United States governing their use. Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Dan Halutz plans to appoint a major general to investigate the use of cluster bombs, some of which were fired against his order during the Lebanon War. Halutz ordered the IDF to use cluster bombs with extreme caution and not to fire them into populated areas. Nonetheless, it did so anyway, primarily using artillery batteries and the Multiple Launch System, MRLS. IDF artillery, MLRS, and aircraft are thought to have delivered thousands of cluster bombs, containing a total of some 4 million bomblets during the war. Human Rights Watch said there was evidence that Israel had used cluster bombs very close to civilian areas and described them as unacceptably inaccurate and unreliable weapons when used around civilians, and that they should never be used in populated areas. Human Rights Watch has accused Israel of using cluster munitions in an attack on Bilda, a Lebanese village, on July 19, which killed 1 civilian and injured 12, including 7 children. The Israeli army defended the use of cluster munitions in its offensive with Lebanon, saying that using such munitions was legal under international law and the army employed them in accordance with international standards. Foreign Ministry spokesman Mark Regev added, NATO countries stock these weapons and have used them in recent conflicts in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The world has no reason to point a finger at Israel. Georgia, 2008. Georgia and Russia both were accused of using cluster munitions during the 2008 South Ossetia War. Georgia admitted use, Russia denied it. Georgia admitted using cluster bombs during the war, according to Human Rights Watch. The Georgian army used LAR-160 multiple rocket launchers to fire Mk4 LAR-160 type rockets, with M85 bomblets, with a range of 45 kilometers. The Georgian Minister of Defense, Mod, said. According to the Human Rights Watch, the Russian Air Force used RBK-250 cluster bombs during the conflict. A high-ranking Russian military official denied use of cluster bombs. The Dutch government, after investigating the death of a Dutch citizen, concluded that a cluster munition was propelled by a 9K720 Iskander tactical missile, used by Russia at the time of conflict, and not used by Georgia. Libya, 2011. It was reported in April 2011 that Colonel Gaddafi's forces had used cluster bombs in the conflict between government forces and rebel forces trying to overthrow Gaddafi's government. During the Battle of Misrata, these reports were denied by the government, and the Secretary of State of the USA, Hillary Clinton, said she was not aware of the specific use of cluster or other indiscriminate weapons in Misrata, even though a New York Times investigation refuted those claims. An ejection canister for a Type 314 AAV submunition, manufactured in France, was found in Libya despite the fact that France is a party to the international convention that bans cluster munitions. Syria, 2012. During the Syrian uprising, a few videos of cluster bombs first appeared in 2011, but escalated in frequency near the end of 2012. As Human Rights Watch reported on October 13, 2012, Elliot Higgins, who blogs on military hardware and tactics used in Syria under the pseudonym Brown Moses, compiled a list of the videos showing cluster munition remnants in Syria's various governorates. The type of bombs have been reported to be RBK-250 cluster bombs with AO-1SCH bomblets, of Soviet design. Designed by the Soviet Union for use on tank and troop formations, PTAB 2.5M bomblets were used on civilian targets in Mer in December 2012 by the Syrian government. South Sudan, 2013. Cluster bombs remnants were discovered by a UN demining team in February 2014 on a section of road near the Jonglei state capital, Bor. The strategic town was the scene of heavy fighting, changing hands several times during the South Sudanese Civil War, which erupted in the capital Juba on December 15, 2013 before spreading to other parts of the country. According to the United Nations Mine Action Service, UNMISS, the site was contaminated with the remnants of up to 8 cluster bombs and an unknown quantity of bomblets. Ukraine, 2014. Human Rights Watch reported that Ukrainian government forces used cluster munitions in populated areas in Donetsk city in early October 2014. Yemen, 2015. British-supplied and U.S.-supplied cluster bombs have been used by Saudi Arabian-led military coalition against Houthi militias in Yemen, as per report of Rights Group. Saudi Arabia is not signatory to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Threat to civilians. While all weapons are dangerous, cluster bombs pose a particular threat to civilians for 2 reasons: they have a wide area of effect, and they have consistently left behind a large number of unexploded bomblets. The unexploded bomblets can remain dangerous for decades after the end of a conflict. Cluster munitions are opposed by many individuals and hundreds of groups, such as the Red Cross, the Cluster Munition Coalition and the United Nations, because of the high number of civilians that have fallen victim to the weapon. Since February 2005, Handicap International called for cluster munitions to be prohibited and collected hundreds of thousands of signatures to support its call. 98% of 13,306 recorded cluster munitions casualties that are registered with Handicap International are civilians, while 27% are children. The area affected by a single cluster munition, known as its footprint, can be very large. A single unguided M26 MLRS rocket can effectively cover an area of 0.23 square kilometers. In US and most Allied services, the M26 has been replaced by the M30 guided missile fired from the MLRS. The M30 has greater range and accuracy but a smaller area of coverage. It is worth noting that for reasons including both danger to civilians and changing tactical requirements, the non-cluster unitary warhead XM31 missile is, in many cases, replacing even the M30. Because of the weapon's broad area of effect, they have often been documented as striking both civilian and military objects in the target area. This characteristic of the weapon is particularly problematic for civilians when cluster munitions are used in or near populated areas and has been documented by research reports from groups such as Human Rights Watch, Landmine Action, Mines Action Canada and Handicap International. In some cases, like the Zagreb rocket attack, civilians were deliberately targeted by such weapons. Unexploded ordnance. The other serious problem, also common to explosive weapons, is unexploded ordnance, UXO, of cluster bomblets left behind after a strike. These bomblets may be duds, or in some cases the weapons are designed to detonate at a later stage. In both cases, the surviving bomblets are live and can explode when handled, making them a serious threat to civilians and military personnel entering the area. In effect, the UXOs can function like landmines. Even though cluster bombs are designed to explode prior to or on impact, there are always some individual submunitions that do not explode on impact. The US-made MLRS with M26 warhead and M77 submunitions are supposed to have a 5% dud rate, but studies have shown that some have a much higher rate. The rate in acceptance tests prior to the Gulf War for this type ranged from 2% to a high of 23% for rockets cooled to 25° F, 32° C, before testing. The M483A1 TPICM artillery-delivered cluster bombs have a reported dud rate of 14%. Given that each cluster bomb can contain hundreds of bomblets and be fired in volleys, even a small failure rate can lead each strike to leave behind hundreds or thousands of UXOs scattered randomly across the strike area. For example, after the 2006 Israel-Lebanon conflict, UN experts have estimated that as many as 1 million unexploded bomblets may contaminate the hundreds of cluster munition strike sites in Lebanon. In addition, some cluster bomblets, such as the Blue 97/B used in the CBU-87, are brightly colored to increase their visibility and warn off civilians. However, the yellow color, coupled with their small and non-threatening appearance, is attractive to young children who wrongly believe them to be toys. This problem was exacerbated in the war in Afghanistan, 2001-present, when U.S. forces dropped humanitarian rations from airplanes with similar yellow-colored packaging as the Blue 97/B, yellow being the NATO standard color for high-explosive filler in air weapons. The rations packaging was later changed first to blue and then to clear in the hope of avoiding such hazardous confusion. The U.S. military is developing new cluster bombs that it claims could have a much lower, less than 1%, dud rate. Sensor-fused weapons that contain a limited number of submunitions that are capable of autonomously engaging armored targets may provide a viable, if costly, alternative to cluster munitions that will allow multiple target engagement with one shell or bomb while avoiding the civilian deaths and injuries consistently documented from the use of cluster munitions. Certain such weapons may be allowed under the recently adopted Convention on Cluster Munitions, provided they do not have the indiscriminate area effects or pose the unexploded ordnance risks of cluster munitions. In the 1980s, the Spanish firm Esperanza YCIA developed a 120 mm caliber mortar bomb which contained 21 anti-armor submunitions. What made the 120 mm Espan unique was the electrical impact fusing system, which totally eliminated dangerous duds. The system operates on a capacitor in each submunition, which is charged by a wind generator in the nose of the projectile after being fired. If for whatever reason the electrical fuse fails to function on impact, approximately 5 minutes later the capacitor bleeds out, therefore neutralizing the submunition's electronic fuse system. Later a similar mortar round was offered in the 81 mm caliber and equipped some Spanish Marine units. On signing the Wellington Declaration on Cluster Munitions, Spain withdrew both the 81 mm and 120 mm Espan rounds from its military units. Civilian deaths from unexploded cluster bomblets. In Vietnam, people are still being killed as a result of cluster bombs and other objects left by the US and Vietnamese military forces. Estimates range up to 300 people killed annually by unexploded ordnance. Some 270 million cluster submunitions were dropped on Laos in the 1960s and 1970s. Approximately one-third of these submunitions failed to explode and continue to pose a threat today. During the 1999 NATO war against Yugoslavia, US and Britain dropped 1,400 cluster bombs in Kosovo. Within the first year after the end of the war, more than 100 civilians died from unexploded British and American bombs. Unexploded cluster bomblets caused more civilian deaths than landmines. Israel used cluster bombs in Lebanon in 1978 and in the 1980s. Those weapons used more than 2 decades ago by Israel continue to affect Lebanon. During the 2006 war in Lebanon, Israel fired large numbers of cluster bombs in Lebanon, containing an estimated more than 4 million cluster submunitions. In the first month following the ceasefire, unexploded cluster munitions killed or injured an average of 3 to 4 people per day. Areas with significant unexploded cluster bomb submunitions: Afghanistan, Indochina, especially in Laos and central Vietnam's former demilitarized zone, Iraq, Lebanon, Nagorno-Karabakh, Serbia, Western Sahara. Countries that have been affected by cluster munitions include Afghanistan, Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia, Chad, Colombia, Croatia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Georgia, including South Ossetia, Iraq, Israel, Kuwait, Laos, Lebanon, Montenegro, Pakistan, Palestine, Russia, Chechnya, Serbia, mainly South Serbia and Kosovo, Sierra Leone, South Ossetia, South Sudan, Syria, Tajikistan, Ukraine, United Kingdom, Falkland Islands, Vietnam, Yemen. International legislation. Cluster bombs fall under the general rules of international humanitarian law, but were not specifically covered by any currently binding international legal instrument until the signature of the Convention on Cluster Munitions in December 2008. This international treaty stemmed from an initiative by the government of Norway known as the Oslo Process, which was launched in February 2007 to prohibit cluster munitions. More than 100 countries agreed to the text of the resulting Convention on Cluster Munitions in May 2008, which sets out a comprehensive ban on these weapons. This treaty was signed by 94 states in Oslo on 3-4 December 2008. The Oslo Process was launched largely in response to the failure of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, CCW, where 5 years of discussions failed to find an adequate response to these weapons. The Cluster Munition Coalition, CMC, is campaigning for the widespread accession to and ratification of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. A number of sections of the Protocol on Explosive Remnants of War, Protocol V to the 1980 Convention, November 28, 2003, occasionally address some of the problems associated with the use of cluster munitions, in particular Article 9, which mandates states parties to take generic preventive measures aimed at minimizing the occurrence of explosive remnants of war. In June 2006, Belgium was the first country to issue a ban on the use, carrying, transportation, export, stockpiling, trade and production of cluster munitions, and Austria followed suit on December 7, 2007. There has been legislative activity on cluster munitions in several countries, including Austria, Australia, Denmark, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and United States. In some of these countries, ongoing discussions concerning draft legislation banning cluster munitions, along the lines of the legislation adopted in Belgium and Austria, will now turn to ratification of the Global Ban Treaty. Norway and Ireland have national legislation prohibiting cluster munitions and were able to deposit their instruments of ratification to the Convention on Cluster Munitions immediately after signing it in Oslo on December 3, 2008. International treaties. Other weapons, such as land mines, have been banned in many countries under specific legal instruments for several years, notably the Ottawa Treaty to ban land mines, and some of the protocols in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons that also help.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.